Welcome to the Community Living Education Project's Sharing Possibilities for Community Connections Learning event. The Community Living Education Project, also known as CLEP, is a program through Rutgers School of Public Health. CLEP is committed to providing individual guidance, mentoring, and education regarding community living resources for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities living in the state of New Jersey. The CLEP team, many who are family members themselves, can serve as a bridge for families whose loved ones may be seeking residential supports outside of the family's home. Today's webinar, The Importance of Behavior Assessments and Behavior Support Plans, is being presented by Ms. Delia Sequeira in collaboration with the Community Living Education Project and the New Jersey Division of Developmental Disabilities. To ensure the highest sound quality possible, all attendees will be muted during today's event. To interact with the host or presenter, please use your Q&A option on your screen. Topic-specific questions will be addressed as long as time allows. For consideration to all of our attendees, we encourage you to keep your questions as general as possible. At this time, I would like to welcome today's presenter, Ms. Delia Sequeira. Delia, welcome.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today we'll be talking about the importance of behavior assessments and behavior support plans. For many of you, this has become a necessary part of everyday functioning for you and those you care for. For some of you, you may be in the process of looking into the process of getting a behavior assessed and getting a behavior support plan with a behavioral team involved. So and if you are not very familiar at all with the process, hopefully this will give you a little primer on some basic information regarding behavior assessments and behavior support plans. My name is Delia Sequeira. I am a behavior analyst with the Division of Developmental Disabilities. And I will give you the webinar objectives. Today we're going to be talking about a few points involving behavior assessments, behavior support plans, but some of the main ones are ruling out medical conditions first and foremost when we're addressing behaviors of interest, looking at pinpointing behaviors of interest to change, whether it's to decrease or to increase, looking at behavior assessments and how they're more than just questionnaires. Decreasing challenging behaviors is just one part of the plan. It's not the entirety of a plan. And how teaching is the most important part of this process. So hopefully as we go along the presentation and as I explain the process of a behavior assessment in a somewhat idealized version and a behavior support plan, you'll be able to capture some of these important points throughout. All right, a little bit about me. If you haven't watched or participated live in the previous webinars that we've had here with DDD and CLEP, you don't know about me. But if you have, welcome back. Thank you for coming back to hear me and explain a little bit more about what I do and behavior analysis in general. But let me give you a little rundown of who I am for those of you who don't know. My name, like I said before, my name is Delia Sequeira. I am a behavior analyst, board certified with a division. My undergraduate work is in applied behavior analysis, as well as my graduate work. I've been certified since the year 2007. So it's been a long time for me in this career. I've worked most of my career with adults. I did have a little bit of time with children, but not that much. My focus is really in, my love is really in working with adults with disability. And I've been working in the state of New Jersey for 12 years, first as a consultant at the developmental centers, and now as a trainer, doing exactly what I'm doing with you guys, but in a more extensive role with DDD. And I'm originally from Florida. That's where I grew up. That's where I got my schooling, my training as a behavior analyst. A little bit about my work with DDD is I offer, along with our resource team, free workshops to provider agencies. Very different from this collaboration with CLEP. We have our own series of webinars and workshops that we offer. 3 of the workshops that I offer are aimed towards direct support staff. And the 5 remaining that I offer are aimed at anyone from managerial place and above. And really, it's just a lot of preliminary information regarding best practices within behavior supports and a lot about applied behavior analysis in general, just some basics about behavior analysis. Those workshops range from anywhere between 2 hours and 3.5 hours. So very much unlike this one, that's very short and just tiny little primers on the information. And our team also has workshops that are provided by speech language pathologists that involve topics in that area, such as communication and swallow disorders. Okay, for those of you that are not familiar with applied behavior analysis, what is applied behavior analysis? Well, it's the application of the science of human behavior to everyday uh, problems with behavior, not just problems, but really the importance of teaching is going to be really clear to see as we go along. The aim is really to improve socially significant behaviors through interventions that are based on these principles of learning theory. And these principles and interventions have been evaluated repeatedly through experiments using reliable and objective measures. The science can be applied in many different areas. This is not just something that is applied with or to settings where children with autism are learning or going to school. It also applies to individuals with developmental disabilities, medicine, so hospitals, doctors, um, behavioral medicine, fitness as well, the workplace, so improving performance in the workplace, behavior-based safety. So if you are familiar with OSHA and all the safety items that have to be in place in the different work areas, that is somewhere where we can also work. Traumatic brain injury, the areas where applied behavior analysis can work is infinite, because if people are there and they're behaving, we can absolutely take a look at what's going on. All right. What can ABA accomplish? In our realm of working with adults with developmental disabilities, we can look at two main issues. One, appropriate behavior. So we look at the idea of increasing appropriate skills and socially important behaviors. So teaching is a huge component. Maintaining those behaviors that are taught and that have been identified as socially significant to the person, and then to generalize or to transfer those behaviors from one situation to many others. So for example, if someone learns how to complete specific chores in the home, some of those skills can be transferred to performing well in a job placement. So we're looking at teaching, maintenance, and generalization of appropriate skills and behaviors. In the realm of inappropriate or challenging behaviors, we look at ways to restrict or narrow the conditions under which those behaviors occur, how we can minimize the interference of those behaviors by modifying learning environment. And the interference really means the interference in that person's everyday functioning. So we want to be able to have someone that can participate, be part of the community, be part of the environment without the limitations that are imposed often by those challenging behaviors. And we want to really teach those replacement behaviors that will take over for those challenging behaviors and provide the same outcome. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about those principles of behavior and you haven't attended the first workshop that CLEP has offered in coordination with me, I do a little tiny primer on the basic principles of behavior, and you could take a look at that webinar in addition to the rest to sort of see all the topics and how they come together. Okay, so why BA, why teach? Well, the 5 points that really are important when we're looking at teaching, why is it so important to teach, is that we want to reach or help the person reach the highest level of independence possible through teaching. And really, we're looking at a person's abilities and capacities, knowing that everybody is capable of learning, and then identifying their abilities and capacities, what can they do, what they are able to do based on biology, based on learning history. So we put all those variables together and we figure out plans of actions so that we can identify ways in which we can teach more effectively. That also helps to improve the quality of life and increase noticeable signs of happiness for the person. Hopefully, we'll be also able to integrate them into the community with as little stigma as possible. That is a huge part of our focus because that has been such a problem in the past. And we want each person to reach their full potential. That is not the same thing as independence. Within the limitations that the person may have, we want to help them reach their fullest potential possible. And we also want to provide the best services while also respecting the person's rights and their wishes. All right, so let's keep going. Let's get started with what is a functional behavior assessment and what is a behavior support plan. So really, the functional behavior assessment is the document that is produced by a behavior specialist, whether that's a behavior support specialist, a behavior analyst, a psychologist. This document will hold a lot of information that has been gathered, and it will provide information regarding the challenging behaviors of interest, the behaviors that are that we are looking to teach, how those behaviors came about, hopefully through some historical data and information that's gathered. We're looking at data. We're looking at all the reasoning why a behavior support plan should be in place. So really, it's the foundational document and the document that gives support for the implementation or the creation of a behavior support plan. So let's look at what should be included in an assessment, in a functional behavior assessment. The first would be a well-defined target behavior. The second will be the indirect assessment. I will be explaining what these are. The third will be a descriptive assessment. Fourth is baseline data. The fifth part, interpretation of the information that's gathered, and a hypothesis, a function of behavior. Six, the hypothesis test. And seven, the interventions which equate to the behavior support plan. So let's take a look at some of these. Now, let me remind you that these are sort of the idealized version of what this document should be. It's not often what you'll find in a real world scenario or in a real world example. I'm sure that once we go through these, for those of you that have experience with these documents, you may have questions regarding what you've seen in the past and how it's not that similar or very similar, or maybe more involved. So I'm giving you sort of a baseline, idealized version of what to look for in these documents for future reference. So it's not meant to teach you how to do these, just to identify the parts and pieces that are beneficial to have within these documents. All right, so let's look at the first part, which is a well-defined target behavior. We've all probably had to face the issue of trying to figure out how to describe a behavior of interest to a professional that's involved in the care or service of a loved one. And so what we want to do is really get enough information to provide you the best tools possible to sort of speak a more clear language with these professionals so that everybody can understand what a good definition of a target behavior is. So the real reason behind this is that a good definition of a target behavior is going to not just be of help in the assessment part, but it's also going to follow throughout the process through the presentation of the challenging behavior and the behavior support plan, the instruction sets that are written regarding the behaviors of interest, and how it's trained to those that will be implementing this plan, how it's, and it really even follows through with future evaluation of the behavior of interest and the way that that plan is implemented and eventually hopefully phased out. So the definition of a target behavior really matters because it kind of follows the person throughout the entire process of behavior support. So let's discuss what is a good definition. So a clear definition matters, right? The definition should be clear enough so if a person who's never met the person we're trying to support reads the definition of the target behavior, they will be able to either measure it or model it reliably. So we were thinking about a very specific way of writing these definitions so that they're very clear. The behavior must be defined so that it is observable and measurable. So including units of measurement in a definition matters, right? So we are looking at the specificity of the label as well. So let me give you the example that is often seen. The behavior aggression, right? I cannot tell you guys how many times I will review plans where the target behavior is labeled as aggression. And under that label, I'm given a laundry list of behaviors that fall under that umbrella category, but they're all different behaviors. So there will be a label of aggression, and then I'll see kicking others, spitting at others, pulling hair, punching others. And so look at all these different behaviors. In actuality, I, as a behavior analyst, would like to address all those behaviors separately, meaning assess them separately for function. If you haven't seen the previous webinars, function is the reason why behavior happens. And that's really the goal of these assessments, to figure out the reason why the behavior happens so that we can then create learning opportunities to teach replacement behaviors that will have the same function, so that the person can access the same outcome through an appropriate behavior. So we really want to look at those labels. They matter. You lose information and detail by labeling all these laundry lists of aggressive behaviors under just one label of aggression. So we have a lot of questions. If I see a label that it says aggression on a plan, I'm going to say, well, who is it aimed towards? What does it look like? What type of aggression are we addressing here? So I want to know more. The label aggression is just simply not specific enough. So let me give you some examples of better definitions. I should have written better rather than good. They're just better. So the non-example of the label is Lucy is aggressive, right? That should not be the way that we label that. Let me give you the definition of the target behavior. Lucy hits other people with her right open palm, usually aiming at upper arms or back, right? That you can probably see how that'd be an easy hit, right, to the back, hard enough and loud enough to be heard up to 30 feet away, resulting in raised skin and bruising. Do you see the difference between just saying aggressive, being aggressive, versus this very clear, specific definition? If I asked any of you who are participating today to go ahead and model this behavior, you probably could. The only thing we're missing here is figuring out when it happens, what evokes this behavior, what's the outcome. And part of this assessment process is to figure out those pieces as well. So what would be a better label for this behavior other than aggression? I would say something like Lucy slaps others. That's much clearer. If you were to read that in a document and it says Lucy slaps others, that's something that most of us have seen or experienced. And so we can sort of picture what it looks like, right? And now with the better definition, you can really see clearly what Lucy does to other people regarding slapping others. You have the right open palm, you have the aim at the upper arms, either one, right? I didn't specify only right or left, and the back, loud enough to be heard over 30 feet away, so across a larger room or throughout 2 rooms. And the outcome, what does it look like on the person on the receiving end? Raised skin, bruising. All right, let's look at another example of a possible better definition. So the non-example, the label that you don't want, is just self-injurious behavior, or SIB for short. What's the better definition of this behavior? Mark bangs his elbows on the table while sitting down. There are usually about 6 inches between his body and the table. So I'm giving you the distance, right? He's either pushed in or not pushed in close to the table. So he's relatively close, about 6 inches. He lifts both arms so that his elbows reach the level of his ears. So I'm sort of demonstrating what that looks like. So he reaches down, the elbows up, brings them down on the table hard enough to be heard 25 feet away, leaves red marks or bleeding on one or both elbows. So what would be a better label for this behavior of self-injury? It would be banging elbows on table. It seems really simple. I cannot tell you how often this just doesn't happen when somebody writes behavior support plans. So hopefully this will help you ask questions when you do face these documents and see these sort of misrepresented behaviors or not clear enough behaviors listed on the documents. All right, how do we prioritize behaviors of interest? That is a question I always get, and is something that is often a point of arguments and conversations with teams, with caregivers, with people involved in supporting a person who is demonstrating challenging behaviors, and really who needs to learn a few alternate behaviors to replace those challenging. So the first question I always ask, is the behavior that we're interested in a danger to the person, to others, or to property? So is it self-injury? Is it aggression, or is it property destruction? And then we look at the intensity. How severe is it? The next question, are there opportunities to use a new learned behavior? Can we teach the alternative behavior that's more appropriate, and will that be better? How long standing is the problem? I have way too many examples where I am asked to either review or participate in looking at a behavior support plan that has been in place for way too long without any changes. And they ask, can you help? Because the person's not getting better, nothing's changing. Well, then my first question is, how long has the plan been in place without any edits, without updates? That can be an issue. At minimum, a behavior support plan and an assessment should be reviewed yearly through the ISP process. However, these documents are not static, they are dynamic. They are meant to be looked at more frequently, more closely, because of the data that should be collected to look at how the behaviors are progressing, whether in a good direction or not a great direction. So whether this person is making progress or is getting worse, that data will drive the process of implementing that plan. That data will drive the necessary changes to those plans, whether we're fading strategies that have been effective and the person no longer needs them, or we're adding strategies or changing strategies because the person is just not making progress. We're looking at those plans as live, dynamic documents. I will tell you that I have been part of plans that have been updated monthly because things change that quickly with the behaviors of interest. Does that also mean that we need to retrain every time that plan is changed? Yes, even if it's minimally through just the changes or the entirety of the plan, depending on how many changes were done. So long-standing plans that have just not seen any change, you should ask questions about why hasn't it been changed? What hasn't been done that could be done to help the person make progress? Number 4, will teaching new appropriate behavior provide more reinforcement for the person? Ideally, that is the goal, right? I've given you guys throughout the example of one of my, the people I supported in Florida at a day program. His name was Bill. Bill used to pull hair to access attention. That was the function of his behavior. It was assessed. It was clearly ruled in as the function. And we taught him to tap shoulders instead of pulling hair. Eventually, pulling hair no longer paid off for him like it used to. He tapped shoulders. Why? Because the reinforcement was much better. What kind of interaction did he receive when he pulled hair? It was typically the, ow, you pulled my hair, that's not nice, versus using the appropriate behavior, which was tapping shoulders. And any of us, any of the young staff that were working there, we were all grad students at the time, saying, Bill, you tapped my shoulder, that's so awesome, what do you need? Let's do something fun. Can you guys see the difference between the quality of the interaction? One is more of a reprimand, and yes, he's getting attention from that because it is a social interaction, but the other is an appropriate response, right? Very high quality social reinforcement involved with tapping shoulders. So we really want to look at the value of those reinforcers. Will teaching the new behavior provide a better, higher value, higher quality reinforcement for the person? Will focusing on the behavior be relevant to future skill development or independence. That's something that we should always be looking for. What else is next for the person? And I may have mentioned to you guys in that webinar, same person, Bill, that we were working with, a gentleman that did function at a lower cognitive level. It was eventually able to have a job, something that not many people, especially his parents, would have ever imagined. We were able to access a job for him at Ace Hardware where he watered the plants. That was only made possible because he stopped pulling hair and had now this appropriate behavior. Had we not worked with him to not pull hair, that would have been a very difficult thing to manage or to access, because he did pull other strangers' hairs, not just people that he knew. So had we taken him to Ace Hardware prior to teaching him how to tap shoulders to access attention, if he would have seen someone at the garden center with a long ponytail and he happened to be in need of accessing some attention, he would have quickly gone to that person, pulled their hair, and said, "Hey, Bill," right? And we don't want that, right? That can put him at risk, that can put him at danger. You don't know how the other person would have responded to that. So once we were able to work with that challenging behavior, we were able to do more, kind of look for that next step for him. How can we improve his environment, his world, his quality of life? Number 6, will changing the behavior produce negative attention or reduce, I'm sorry, not produce, reduce negative attention? The idea is that you're looking for that reduction, right? Think again of Bill. Without having changed that target behavior, Bill was a very difficult gentleman to take out into the community because we were always having to manage and monitor him to not go and pull hair. He was a risk in the sense that if he did that to someone else, you didn't know what could have happened to him, right? From a simple assault, meaning somebody else pushed him or hit him, to having charges pressed against him. I mean, the gamut is wide there with some of the issues that could have come up. So we want to really be able to work on those challenging behaviors and teach appropriate in order to reduce that negative attention or stigma. Will the new behavior produce reinforcement for significant others, meaning those who are supporting the person, the caregivers, family, peers, you name it? Without Bill pulling hair anymore, it was just so much more pleasant to work with him. It made it so much easier on us, his parents, it made it more pleasant. So yes, the amount of reinforcement for all of us supporting him absolutely increased. It was just easier to spend the day with him, supporting him throughout and teaching him new things. We also want to look at the likelihood for success. And lastly, and unfortunately, we do have to consider costs. So we have to address the cost of the intervention and how to prioritize challenging behaviors. Now, in some cases, just from my experience, so I cannot speak for others, but in my experience, I have absolutely been told to focus on the most severe behavior first because it absolutely needs reduction to make the person's environment safer, keep them from hurting themselves or others or destroying property. But I've also been in cases or involved in cases where we don't necessarily target the worst, most pressing behavior first. We stabilize that one, but because we need to get buy-in from staff or from others, we will focus on an easier behavior to change to demonstrate the benefit of changing behavior, right? To demonstrate the process of changing behavior and to get that faster sort of buy-in from staff, especially when you have staff who are having a difficult time with the changes that are being introduced. So it's really going to depend on the person, on the environment under which the person is being supported. But those questions are always important to ask when you're looking at prioritizing behaviors of interest. Okay, so now let's start talking briefly about what should be in a behavior assessment. So the first part, most behavior analysts, this is not something that every behavior specialist will do, but behavior analysts have sort of been trained in this particular process. The first thing we do with a behavior support plan after defining the behavior and pinpointing the behaviors of interest, We look at indirect assessments. What is an indirect assessment? Well, this is the time that you gather as much information as possible about the person that's being supported. This is when you do not do direct observations of the person. You're really just taking this time to gather information. You do interviews with people that are supporting the person, whether it's family caregivers or other professionals. It involves the recollection and verbal reports of others who are interacting with that person daily. So what are some of the tools that can be included in an indirect assessment? Well, the first one, structured interviews. And there's a variety of them that are being used. I'm giving you some examples here: the FAST, the MAS, the QABF, or the FAI. All are different structured interviews that are meant to gather information from those supporting the person. I would tell you that I have absolutely encountered scenarios where a behavior specialist gives me an interview and says, here's the assessment. And I look at that person and I say, no, that's just an interview. That is not the entirety of the assessment. We need more information. And then I provide them sort of this guideline of what they need to access as far as information goes. Also, another thing about interviews, if you're going to include interviews in a functional assessment, it cannot just be one. Why is that? It's because there could be bias from the person that is responding, and you really want to have more than one interview. I would say on average 3 to 5, dependent on how many people are working with the person that's being supported and that needs to be have behaviors assessed to have a behavior support plan. So 3 to 5 will give you a little bit more information that will hopefully neutralize some of the bias that could potentially exist in the responses. We also look at behavior checklists, which can be used in a multitude of ways. The way that I use them is as I'm doing reviews of documentations, it helps me to check off information that's pertinent, what the behavior is, what seems to be the antecedent that evokes the behavior, and what seems to be the outcome of the behavior of interest, location, time, where the behaviors occur, the timeframes, that sort of thing. So I'm giving you just a brief example of a really old version of the QABF. I could not find a more recent one, and it's probably better because some of these things do have copyrights on them. But here's an example of a QABF. It's essentially questions that are very specific towards the functions of possible behaviors that are answered through Likert scales or points. And so the way that they are filled out sort of gives totals, and those totals give you some semblance of potential function based on the responses of somebody, of the caregiver that you've interviewed or that has been interviewed. Here's an example of a behavior checklist. As you can see, it's a very general just kind of document. This is an example of one. There's many others that are available that look different, but the goal is the same, to sort of look at different behaviors when they're happening. You could check off, and that's a little bit easier. You could look at the antecedents, the consequences or the outcomes, locations, activities. This one even includes the group size, how many people were around. And you can collect some information as you go. Here's the bigger thing for me. When you're collecting information, you definitely want to look at some of the records that this person may have. So the active treatment notes, if you're looking at day programs or group homes or developmental centers. Admissions reports are always beneficial. Annual summaries, historical data, very, very important. Medical consults. One of the biggest things that people forget is that often medical issues can initiate challenging behaviors, especially if the person cannot communicate well on their own that they're having issues, or that they're trying to manage them themselves in some way, shape, or form. I've absolutely worked in cases where stomach pain from an eventual cancer diagnosis has caused the person to engage in self-injury, striking their stomach for various potential reasons, right? One, when you are hit or when you have that sort of hard contact, endorphins are released. It may feel different. It may subside some of the pain and change the feel of it. There's so many things that can happen, right, regarding challenging behaviors and medical concerns. So what behavior analysts are very clearly taught from the get-go is rule out all medical concerns. before you initiate any behavior interventions for challenging behaviors. Why is that so important? It's because if you don't rule out medical and the behavior is stemming from a medical concern and you implement a behavior support plan, the behavior support plan won't have any effect on the behavior if the medical piece is not being treated. In fact, it could actually make things worse at times. And it's, I'm gonna say the word, it's kind of neglectful to not address those medical concerns, right? You want to make sure that that those problems are not medically based, because if they are found to be medically based, then they need medical treatment right away. So that's my piece about medical. Medical rollout, absolutely a priority for any and all behavior support or behavior concerns. The next thing that we look at, past or current ISPs, past behavior support plans, to see if there are any issues that are still occurring or any new ones that are occurring, past behavioral data, assessments, psychological reports, speech and language reports. All of these things are very beneficial to know about. Okay. So the indirect assessment can also include an ecological assessment. This is what I call observing the environment without the person in it. It gives you a nice place of being able to compare and contrast. So you get to see the environment that behaviors may be occurring in. Say it's a day program, a day that the person's not there. So as a behavior specialist, as a behavior analyst, I'm told, hey, you're seeing Joe for assessing Joe's behavior. He's not going to be here on this day. I might say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go over to see what the environment looks like without him, because I know I also have to observe the environment with him. Those two observations can give me a lot of information about how Joe interacts with his environment, what is going on in the environment with and without him there, and how those behaviors may be evoked or what outcomes may be happening. Okay, so what should the indirect assessment identify? Essentially, the times when the behavior is most or least likely to happen, the activities during which the behavior is most or least likely to happen, the people with whom the behavior is most or least likely to occur, and the settings under which those behaviors occur or do not occur. So this is just part one of the assessment, right? We have the definitions, the pinpointing. Now we have part one of the assessment, which is all the data all the information gathering. Now we move on to the next part, the descriptive assessment. This is really the direct observations. This is when we go and look at everything involving the client with the client there. So it helps to confirm or rule out information that we've gathered through the indirect assessment piece, and they should be ideally conducted after the indirect assessment. So this part should ideally occur after. However, ideally is not always the case. There are going to be times where a behavior specialist is told, this is an emergency, you need to get all of this done right away. And that has to happen. So they'll be doing parts and pieces around the same time frame without that chronological separation. And it can be done. Is it ideal? No, but you could probably still get good information regardless of the order in which you're doing this. Okay, so types of descriptive assessments, those ABC data sheets, the forms, the tools that we can use to help us gather the best information possible for those direct observations. So if you're familiar with ABC data sheets, they're essentially data sheets where you write the antecedent, what happens before the behavior, and there's more specificity to that, the actual action or the behavior, and the outcomes. And so there's different forms for that. There's also scatter plots where you can identify when behavior occurs using time frames. And so that can help you find patterns of the occurrence of the behavior in time. So let me give you some very brief examples. This is a structured ABC data sheet. Not only do you have one side where the person can freehand write some of the items, but you also have checklists where the person can check off the events. And that's very helpful for people because then they don't have to figure out how to write what happened during an event. They could just check off specifically. And so I have some examples here. This is the behavior's aggression, What do we know about that? That's not a good label. The antecedent, or in this case, the variable that evokes the behavior is a demand, right? Wash your hands. The behavior is that Tanya throws soap at staff, and the outcome is that she's asked to leave the dining room. So this is an example that came from one of my my times in developmental centers where there were sinks in the dining area. And sometimes, actually, no, this is from my time in the day program where there was a sink connected to the dining area. So the locations are a little odd, which is why the dining area is this example given. But the thing you could see here is that those are the same exact items that are checked off. And I apologize, they're very small font, so very difficult to see, but I promise that the same antecedents, behavior, and outcomes are checked off. And so it makes it a little easier, a little faster for staff to be able to provide that information through the data sheet. Here's another example of an ABC. This is kind of that free form data sheet where everything is handwritten in without any checks. And so you can see how that is done. Okay, here's an example of a scatter plot, and what you can see is that the day is split up by time frames, and in the scoring legend, it shows you how to score the plot area. You looking at the number of occurrences of the behavior. So if there's no occurrences of behavior, you just put a little 0. If there's 5 occurrences or less, a little slash. And if there's 5 occurrences of more of the specific behavior, it's a block. Now, I must say that these are completely and totally, you can individualize them. You can personalize them. And so it doesn't have to follow this exact pattern or this exact breakdown of the day. You really can look at the person, what behaviors they're engaging in, how often, and you can modify all of these pieces of information on this sheet in order to create one that's more personalized to the person. Okay, next step, baseline data. Oh, baseline data. Data is critical. And if you guys want to know more about data, next November 19th is our last webinar, and that will be all about data. So we're going to be able to talk and discuss a little bit more about data then, but I want to demonstrate the importance of baseline data here. Baseline data should be always collected prior to implementing a behavior support plan. The reason why is because we want to capture what the challenging behavior looks like pre-intervention so that we have a good comparison point for the effectiveness of the intervention. Not only do we want to capture the information regarding the target behavior, we also want to look at the behavior we're trying to teach. What's happening with that? Is it not happening at all? Maybe happening not often enough? Again, it gives us a comparison point for the intervention and what's happening throughout the intervention and even after the intervention, because we could see the maintenance of different behaviors post-intervention through that continued data collection. So baseline data is very, very important. The different types of data we can collect are frequency, rate, duration, percent occurrence, and there's a whole slew more that we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks. Okay, and baseline data is also helpful because it'll also guide the entirety of that data set. Baseline, intervention, and post-intervention will also affect the eventual fading and hopeful fading of a plan. Okay, so the 5th part is to interpret all this information, right? We gather as much information as we can so we can figure out the motivation, which is the function, right? All of this together is the function. What antecedents, what behavior of interest, and what outcomes are all taking place in order to maintain these challenging behaviors and how we can modify those. And that's really what we do with all the information. You can also, dependent on the level of expertise of the person that's writing the plan, there might be a test of hypothesis. So not only will they interpret the information, they'll hypothesize the information. So here we have, for example, Tanya is prompted to wash her hands in preparation of the meal. She screams and throws the soap at staff, which is followed by the termination of hand washing and meal by being asked to leave the area. Hypothesized function, I might say it's either escape from hand washing or the meal. So that still leaves me a question, right? Like, what is it exactly that's setting up the event, right? Is it escape from one or the other? So the test would be that I can test which one of these events is the one that's actually setting up the behavior. And so that behavior professional should be the one taking care of that. Actually, the behavior professional is the one that should be doing all of this. So we want to make sure that that's something that is remembered and really emphasized. Now let's look at part 7, which is the plan, right? Part 7 is the intervention. What should be in a behavior support plan? Ideally, you're looking again to include a description of the target behaviors of interest, a small summary of that FBA, because that's the supporting document, right? It's the reason. What skills you're teaching, or those functional equivalent skills. What are the proactive strategies that are being used to change and modify the environment to promote better behavior or the teaching process? What reactive strategies are being implemented if the challenging behavior does occur, right? The whole idea behind the plan is that you're trying to prevent the behavior from occur, but there are times where the challenging behavior will occur. And so how are we going to react in a more helpful manner, right? In a better manner? What the data collection will look like, evaluation criteria for the plan. You also, in the documentation, probably want to include the benefits and the risks of the behavioral intervention and any special considerations that can have an effect on how the plan is implemented. So let's look at all of those pieces. Like I said, the function of the behavior should drive and guide the intervention. So if we're looking at an example, Bill, right? If Bill engages in pulling hair to access attention from others, and the intervention is going to be driven by that function. We still want him to access attention. That's perfectly acceptable and a normal basic human need. How do we want him to do it this time is through that better interaction, right? That socially appropriate interaction of tapping shoulders. So his intervention was that, teaching him how to tap shoulders while not providing reinforcement for pulling hair, and teaching him all the different places, locations, generalizing that behavior across different environments. So we want to incorporate the definition of pulling hair. We want to incorporate the definition of tapping shoulders, because all of these things are going to help with the instruction sets, the interventions, and eventually the training of these plans. So the brief summary of how that behavior was assessed should also be included, again, because it's just a supporting document. The other reason is more of a, it's just helpful because oftentimes if there is an FBA and a BSP, they're typically not in the same document. They get split up at times. One will go to like a document folder, one will go to like the group folder or the person's folder. So those documents can be separated. If you have that little summary within the FBA, I'm sorry, within the BSP of the FBA, it can help to sort of keep that information included so that it's not forgotten or lost. Okay, interventions. Proactive strategies are probably the most important, and your plan should be heavy-handed on those versus reactives. Those proactive strategies are created so that changes are made to the environment, so that there's teaching possibilities, so that you're looking for ways to make the day go better for everyone and prevent the challenging behavior from happening. This is where you teach those alternative behaviors as well, and also where you look at precursor behaviors. So those little behaviors that signal to you that the challenging one might be occurring in the very near future, and you can still intervene without the occurrence of the challenging behavior, those interventions should also live in the place of proactives. Okay, so let me show you some examples just visually of what this looks like, right? So as far as the proactive strategy, so let's look at this example. Typically, Joe has issues with being left with too much work to complete at his job program, right? So if you are looking at a proactive strategy where you alter the antecedent or you're altering the environment to prevent the target behavior, this is some of the things that you can do. In this case, Joe is provided with a work coach during work periods that can help to teach him how to complete the tasks when he needs it. Right? So if he needs help, the job coach is there to intervene, provide assistance, reinforce requests for assistance, you name it, all those things that are being taught. So the behavior, the challenging behavior in this case, which is hitting others, which is followed by removal of the task, are completely irrelevant because we've modified the environment. We're not leaving him with too much work. Let's look at the example of teaching, right? So say we want to teach Joe to ask for assistance. Maybe we leave him with too much work initially, but the job coach is there to teach and prompt Joe to ask for help. When he does that, right, whether it's verbally, I need help, or if it's sign language, I need help, right? Or a sign, a Mac button that speaks for him, an iPad, you name it, whatever the method, he asks for help, then the outcome is the reinforcer. He is provided with assistance so that the work can be completed well, and he doesn't have to go ahead and hit someone to have the task end. Now, let's look at the reactive, right? If for some reason someone forgets and they leave too much work for Joe and his coach is not around, they haven't, and he actually goes ahead and hits someone, right? Instead of using his request for help, now we have the outcome, right? Instead of terminating the work immediately, which immediately reinforces the challenging behavior, we look at a way to sort of circumvent that outcome, de-escalate the situation, redirect Joe to either completing the task and request break, or ask for help to get the assistance he needs, and then request a break so that he can be reinforced for the appropriate responses rather than the hitting, right? So these are different examples of how to look at visually what, how to see visually what a plan needs to be doing, right? And this is why it's so important to include those proactives and those teaching skills. They are the most important piece of a behavior support plan. If you see a behavior support plan that is full of reactives, they're letting the behavior happen and they're just reacting to it, I'm going to say that's not going to be an effective plan. It could give you temporary results. It's not going to give you long-term changes in behavior because you're not teaching, right? You're not teaching those replacements that are more socially appropriate and longer standing because they are maintained through the reinforcement of those appropriate skills. Okay, let's talk briefly about data collection because we're getting to the end of our time. So data should be collected for both target behavior, meaning the challenging behavior, and the replacement skill. You want to see what's happening with both. And all staff, all caregivers, anybody supporting the person should be taught how to collect data because everybody should be trying to access this information. It's extremely beneficial to evaluate the efficacy of the plan, to evaluate whether the plan needs changes, to evaluate whether the plan could be phased out. And we really want to focus on this information. Data is critical. When you don't have data, you're making decisions out of thin air, essentially, or maybe biased opinions, not accurate information, inaccurate information. So we really want to look at data and teach and train on how to collect data properly. We also want to look at data reliability, meaning having inter-observer agreements. So at times, you're going to want to have two people taking data at the same time where they are not communicating, they're taking their individual data, and then bringing that data later on, looking at it, comparing and contrasting, and seeing if it's similar or not. If it's similar, you have good IOA. If it's not similar, you're running into some issues regarding data, maybe the definitions of the target behaviors, but all of this we will be talking about in 2 weeks. So if you're interested in knowing more, I will be here talking about that. Procedural reliability, meaning how well is that plan being implemented? One of the biggest issues that we've run into with plans and implementation is the lack of consistency of implementation, meaning not everybody's implementing the plan the way it should be. Some people may not be implementing at all. And some people may be implementing perfectly, but that variability will cause issues with the target behavior. You're not going to see the best changes. You're not going to see the best results when you're looking at that. And as a matter of fact, in some cases, you may see worsening of the behavior because there's intermittent reinforcement for both the appropriate and the inappropriate behaviors, and that can be problematic. So we really want to look at the procedural reliability, meaning you're going to want to have staff, especially the behavior support staff, conduct observations of anybody that's implementing the plan to see how they're doing it and to provide feedback, whether it's immediate teaching feedback. For me, teaching feedback is the replacement of corrective feedback. Corrective feedback can often be punitive in nature, and what you want is you want staff to sort of continue to try their best to implement the plan well, rather than to be punished for not implementing the plan correctly, because that's just going to get them to perform worse and worse over time. You want staff to perform better and better over time. So having that observation, that joint feedback loop, right, between the observer and the person implementing the plan, that's beneficial for the reliability of the implementation. You also want to look at the evaluation criteria. So collecting and analyzing that data matters in order to address the plan's efficacy. So you can evaluate whether that plan is working or not and how it needs to change or not, an eventual hopeful fading of the plan. So you guys can take a look at this. There's a lot of little paragraphs here that just really explain in a little bit more detail what I'm talking about. But you really want to look at evaluating a plan. If you don't evaluate a plan, you run the risk of having a stagnant plan that never changes, that never evolves, that becomes stagnant rather than continues to be dynamic. Okay, let's look at some of the last information here, which is the benefits and the risks of behavior support plans. We should always take a look at that because there will be times where the interventions may be risky, but you have to weigh out the risks and the benefits, especially really important if you're dealing with plans that have more restrictive procedures, making them level 2 or level 3 plans as per Circular 34 from DDD, because those restrictive components may get the person who we're trying to support to engage in some temporary challenging behaviors, but over time with consistency that may change, right? So we really want to look at the benefits and the risks, and all of these are going to be very individualized, specific variables to the person. I don't think I did the last, I apologize, but the last one was the any issues that may come in with the implementation of a plan. So any like any concerns that, let me go back real quick and show you guys. I believe it's here, the special considerations. So the special considerations should have been that last slide, and I apologize it's not there, but the special considerations matter because these special considerations will have an effect. You want to really look at the variables that are affecting the person's daily living, medical issues. Those special considerations might have an effect on how a plan is run. So say, for example, you are working with someone who needs a behavior support plan, who is having one being created, and the target behavior is aggression, but they also happen to have diabetes, right? So they have diabetes, and when their blood sugar drops, they may become agitated and aggressive. So if he has a plan for aggression, and more specifically, a very specific kind of aggression, let's say kicking others, but they also get a little bit aggressive when their sugar is low by like ramming into people or getting them out of the kitchen, you want to make those distinctions so that staff are aware. This is what the aggression that the plan is for looks like. This is what aggression looks like when his blood sugar is down. So staff can really intervene in a much better way and more specific way, targeting the need at the moment. So if the person is running into the kitchen and ramming into people to get them out of the way to get to a snack or a juice or something, then they know that at that moment, maybe the person's blood sugar is low and they need to intervene medically, whether there's medication that they're given on the spot or sucrose tablets, or the nurse is in house, or you name it, intervene in a specific manner, versus if they kick up here, and then you know the function of that and how to intervene for that. So you're looking at those special considerations as very critical pieces to understand and know, because they have an effect on how the plan will be implemented. So I think that's all I have for today. It's a lot of information. If you feel a little overwhelmed, I am so sorry, and I don't blame you, because there is a lot of information regarding what an FBA and a BSP should look like. I've given you just a little tiny primer on what that process should be, ideally. Obviously, it's going to vary slightly for each person, for each person's individualized needs. But now you have a little bit more information to take with you if and when you have to deal with this process for the person that you're either caring for or supporting in your world. So that is it for me. We have a couple of more webinars involved in this series. The parts 1 through 3 are already recorded and available to watch via YouTube, and there's links from the CLEP website for those. And the 5th and last webinar for this series will be on November 19th, I believe. If it's wrong, I apologize, but I think that's the date. Maybe Melanie will clarify for us when she pops back in here. But I've given you guys the notes on what these are. So we have, webinar 1 and 2, what they are with their bullets, with their objectives, parts 3 and 5, what the titles are and their objectives. So thank you guys so much for spending this hour with me, talking about behavior support plans and those functional behavior assessments, which are the foundational document. If you get a behavior support plan for someone that you're caring for, a loved one, or a person you're trying to support without an FBA, ask questions. That FBA should have been completed, because if not, I would question how or why they came up with the interventions that were written for the plan. So that's my last and hopeful, helpful hint of the day. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. This is my email. We'll probably leave this on the screen. And I do leave my references with all my PowerPoint presentation, so you could see where I've gathered some of this information as well. Thank you guys so much. And I am now turning it over to Melanie.
Delia, thank you so much. We're getting a lot of really positive comments. I will definitely share those with you after the presentation.
Thank you.
Delia, if you have time, I would like to take an extra 5 minutes or so just to briefly cover a few of the general questions, if okay?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So Delia, can you just briefly talk about the different functions of behavior? What are the primary functions of behavior that behavior analysts?
So the primary functions of behavior are access to tangibles, access to attention, the escape function when you're, so the first two, access to tangibles and access to attention, it's when there's a deprivation of those in the person's environment, right? It's something that they need. The escape function occurs when they have too much of something, right? Anything that we don't like, don't want, don't need. So whether that's, and it can really be anything, right, for that escape function. It could be people, so too much attention, too many things, too much pain, too much, really anything. And so the person will engage in behaviors to get away from escape, right? And then the last function is kind of a sensory, automatic, internal function that is closely tied with everything that's going on within. And so those 4 functions really, once we can pinpoint which one of those 4 functions a target behavior is being driven by, it becomes a lot easier to create an alternative behavior or to come up with an alternative behavior to teach. So if someone's engaging in a challenging behavior to escape, you can easily teach an appropriate behavior to request a break or request that termination, right, of whatever it is that's happening. Or you can look at other things. If you're looking at the environment, looking at ways to maybe decreasing the aversity or the aversiveness of any particular event that the person is trying to get away from, and then work on shaping that up as you go along. So what's important here is that you should have a behavior support specialist involved to really determine and pinpoint what these are and the specific pieces that make this come together. especially when a person is like involved, like a parent or a caregiver that's so close, sometimes you miss those variables and little things that can give you a lot of information. A specialist, a behavior specialist that comes in and provides supports should be able to pick these up a little bit faster, because that's what we get trained on, and help to provide better solutions, right, for specific challenging problems. I think that's all I have. But if you want to know a little bit more, please look at webinar 1. I believe that's the one where we did some basic principles of behavior. It's about an hour, a little bit above an hour maybe. And I do describe it a little bit more there. So you could take the time to look at that.
And we did share that link in this chat section. So
Perfect.
anyone interested in hearing any of the previous sessions or registering for the upcoming sessions, please use that link. We'll also send out additional details and follow-up emails. Delia, can you talk a little bit about the assessments, and if someone is exhibiting similar behaviors in different environments, would separate assessments happen in each of those environments, or would it be a blend?
So it could be one document, but information should be gathered from both locations. So I think what's going to depend here is who's providing the behavior supports for the person. Are they receiving behavioral supports from both locations? Then you might have two separate assessments, right? One where the focus is in one environment, and the other, say a group home, and the other where the behavior support team, say at the day program, also produces an assessment. So you may have separate assessments. In some cases, you have behavior support teams that are providing supports for both locations. So you should have one document, but information from both environments. I think that's the route that I would take. I don't know how others are doing.
Wonderful. And again, right, quite often, Delia, you're going to have to ask someone many more follow-up questions to give them a specific response.
Yes.
But this is just providing some guidance for families to build on the foundation and to then further explore options with the person who's providing their the behavior supports to their loved one.
Absolutely.
So Delia, if I can just get to a few more questions. I think we have some incredible questions coming in for this session. How would someone get baseline data if staff are inconsistently implementing a current BSP?
So the data, I think at that point, would have to be collected by a behavior specialist or surrogate for the behavior specialist, and not for the staff. Either because you're trying to update a plan or implement a new plan or create a new plan, there's something that's already in place. You should note that that baseline data is going to be related to a plan that's being poorly implemented. But I think at that point, it's not the staff that should be collecting it, unless you ask like one staff person, have them just focus on that. But there should be a more individualized data collection happening there, not something that staff would be doing all along with the improper implementation of a plan. And there's a lot of variables there that I actually would question, and maybe something that you should be discussing with your behavior support team or specialist that's involved. Why is a plan being implemented incorrectly is probably my first question. What can we do to change that? What are the barriers to implementing that plan better? Is the plan just a poor plan that's difficult to implement? There's a whole slew of questions that I would sort of attach to that issue. Also, why is baseline data why should baseline be collected while there's a plan in place? So there's a couple of things. Maybe it's not that you want to call that baseline data, but just kind of like a fidelity check, IOA type data, seeing what's happening with the plan that's being implemented and what the specialist is observing at the moment. So it really should be someone else that's more trained or better trained to collect some data to find out maybe some comparisons or evaluative data.
Wonderful. So I do want to get to one more question. I will say this question, I'm not sure if it's going to vary from agency to agency, but I'm going to pose it to you. And maybe if you don't have the response, maybe we can point the person in the right direction with some resources
Right.
in order to get that. So the next question is, are behavior plans allowed to be shared with the client's guardians? So the individual being supported guardian. Should the guardians be informed of their loved one's progress? And if this is permissible, what is the protocol for obtaining this information?
So as long as the guardian is the legal guardian, you have to consider this to be a document that's covered by HIPAA. It's PHI, it's personal, oh gosh, now I forgot the exact definition of PHI, but
We'll look it up, it's okay.
yeah, but really it's if you think about a medical record, right? Say you're a parent and you are the legal guardian of the person that's being supported, you absolutely have rights to access that information and can request it, and it should be provided, it should be shared. If you are not the legal guardian for the person, if the person being supported is their own legal guardian, then there needs to be permissions that are provided. So that is a whole nother process. But if you are the legal guardian, and you do have rights to that information, you absolutely can request it and have it be shared with you and only you, because again, it's covered under HIPAA, and it can't just be used for anything, but it can be provided to you as the legal guardian, and it should be.
And actually, Colleen McKay Wharton, who also is with CLEP, just shared its, I believe, personal health information.
Thank you. Yes.
And I have heard families also requesting the raw data in regards to the data collected when doing the FBA. I know that there's maybe some rules and regulations around that compared to graft data. So if the person has additional questions, can they reach out to you, Delia, for
They can.
specific guidance? Great.
Absolutely. And I would say that the issue with raw data versus graphed data, graph data is just a lot easier to visualize and see progress or changes, especially if you request daily graphs. If the agency can provide you with daily graphs rather than monthly. If you think about what happens with monthly data is that it's aggregated and averaged out. So it's not always easy to see changes that are occurring. Is it beneficial? Sure. But can you get better information from a daily graph? Yes. And so that sometimes is a little bit better than strict raw data, unless you want the raw data for your documentation, sure. Or to see how staff are actually kind of collecting that data, that then I could also see the benefit of getting the raw data sheets themselves.
Wonderful. So Delia, as always, thank you again. We greatly appreciate. So this behavioral series is not over yet. We do have one more presentation within this series. We will make sure to send out that link to everyone who's in attendance today. If you have any questions, any specific needs, you do have my email address in some of the follow-up emails you received with the webinar link. Delia's information is on the screen. Also, as we sign off today, you're going to see a very brief, maybe 30-second post survey. We strongly encourage you to answer that survey if you could. It's information that you provide us that allows us to better serve the needs of the community, moving forward with topic-specific presentations. So Delia, again, thank you so much. We greatly appreciate this, and we look forward to our next presentation. Be well.
Yes, all about data.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good one.